And so Republicans voted to raise the minimum wage.
Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota all voting in favor of raising it.
Some Americans say business hurts poor people.
Capitalism might be the problem that creates so many poor people.
Famous actors tell the United Nations fossil fuels will kill us.
Accelerated climate change is here right now.
It is? Some people believe all kinds of things. Do you believe in ghosts?
I do.
Yes. People have seen ghosts. I don't need proof for it.
No proof?
Be reasonable. That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
We like to think that we are rational creatures. We're logical. We form our beliefs based on facts.
Do you consider yourself a rational person?
Very rational. I don't know about him, but I'm very rational.
Rational? Yeah, absolutely.
And yet so many Americans believe ridiculous things.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Yes.
Yes. People have seen ghosts.
The house I grew up in Los Angeles actually had a ghost.
Since my mom died, I believe that she's around. I feel that she's around, and my mother-in-law. I don't need proof for it.
She doesn't need proof for it. Pollsters say more than a third of Americans believe in ghosts, and almost as many believe in astrology, believe that their futures can be predicted based on positions stars were in when they were born.
Do you believe in astrology?
Absolutely. Everything happens from the stars.
I love astrology. I'm a big believer, yeah.
Yeah, I'm deep into it.
Why? Everything happens from the stars? It makes no sense. Dozens of studies have debunked astrology. I'll explain how many astrologers fool people later in the show. But first, why do so many people believe in dubious things? Let's ask the editor of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer. He wrote the book, The Believing Brain, How We Construct Beliefs and Reinforce Them. Our brains are faulty, Michael? It leads us to believe in nonsense?
Well, I wouldn't say they're faulty, but they do believe in nonsense because we believe just about everything we hear or see or read about or are told by others. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. Imagine you're an ancient human on the plains of Africa millions of years ago and you hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator or just the wind? If you assume that the rustle in the grass is a dangerous predator and it turns out it's just the wind, no harm done. You just move out of the way. You become more skittish or whatever. But if you believe that the rustle in the grass is just the wind and it turns out it's a dangerous predator, you're lunch. You've just been taken out of the gene pool by a predator, and so
you don't give birth to people who give birth to us. So those genes
that's right. We're the descendants.
Extinguished.
We're the descendants of those most likely to believe everything is real just in case it is. Our brains are like lawyers, marshaling the evidence to support the case that is your belief. So once you form the belief, I think astrology is real, I think everything happens for a reason, whatever it is. You just find the evidence to fit it, and you ignore the evidence that doesn't fit it.
So people believe in things like ghosts and global warming, but aliens? A Harris poll says about a third of Americans believe in UFOs.
Do you think there are aliens?
Yes. Aliens, yes, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes, I do.
100%.
I mean, what's that about?
So what's going on here is that aliens are sort of like gods or deities or something bigger than us. And we know from psychological research that people naturally think that everything happens for a reason, that the way things unfold in life are designed, that there's something out there that kind of tries to make sense of the whole universe, makes sense, directs and controls things. And so aliens are a kind of version of that there's somebody out there that knows about us and is watching us, that sort of thing.
I just look at the numbers and they are appalling to me. 42% ghosts, 36% UFOs, astrology, witches, reincarnation. It makes me wonder, why do people become Democrats or Republicans? Is that not based on logic?
No, actually, political parties are a kind of a tribal belief. You gravitate toward the worldview that feels best for you, and then you find the evidence to fit it.
It's what your friends believe, what your parents believe. But how does this explain us libertarians? Because almost no one is a libertarian. I think I came to my beliefs because the liberal soup I'd been swimming in, my liberal clan, no longer made sense to me once I really researched it. But aren't I logical to become a libertarian? It's just logic.
Libertarians are a tribe. We are. We stand for a particular set of core beliefs involving the power of the individual, autonomy of the individual, freedom of the individual. We want to be left alone. But nevertheless, if you veer too far from the core set of ideologies like I did, you know, I got a lot of angry letters from libertarians say, hey, you're not a member of our tribe anymore. They didn't say it that way. They just said, you know, you've given up on freedom. You don't believe in the Constitution. Oh, you want to burn the Constitution? No. So there's that emotive sense, like you violated our tribe and what we stand for. That's pure emotions, John. There's no logic there at all.
And just to be clear, when you say you believe in climate change, I mean, I believe in climate change too. Climate changes. But do you believe it's a catastrophe?
There are those that think that the world is nearly coming to an end. I don't think so. I don't think the evidence supports that. But when you make these projections out a century or two, I think the error bars, the error margins are too wide.
Okay, we're going to cover that later in the show. Thank you, Michael Shermer. I want to believe that people in business are rational because money's at stake. If you're hiring someone, you want to make sure the new employee is competent. But it turns out that job recruiters are not rational about that either. Once in my ABC days, I sent pairs of actors out to apply for the same job. I gave them the exact same resume, told them to say roughly the same things, and they did. There was really only one difference between the two people. One was especially good looking. The other was not.
Before we sent them out, we had a makeup artist increase the difference. She touched up the lookers and, well, with the others, added some blemishes and bags under their eyes. Then we sent them out in matching outfits. Both applied for the same secretarial job. Even without seeing this recruiter's face, you can hear the warmth in his voice as he talks to pretty Danya.
Well, I guess it's just me right now. Yeah. But, you know, looking for somebody that we like to have a good time at the same time.
To less attractive Amy, the interviewer says roughly the same things, but his tone is less friendly. He tells her there's a lunch break.
Monday through Friday with a 45-minute lunch break.
But with good-looking Danya, the lunch break is more flexible.
Company policy is 45 minutes, but, you know, we're not real strict around here on that kind of stuff.
He told Danya she was likely to be hired.
You're definitely in the lead right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He later offered her the job. He never even called Amy back.
And the pattern continued with employer after employer. We did the same test with two male actors, same result. The good-looking people did much better. We hear about people being racially biased or sexist, but lookist or looksist? I bet people are even more irrational about good looks. Economist Robin Hanson says we have all kinds of biases that we don't think about, and he writes a blog called Overcoming Bias. So do you buy this lookist bias?
Absolutely. Now, an economist would say he's perfectly rational to be selfish in choosing the woman he likes better, but he probably thinks he's doing it for the company.
And what's the point of your blog, Overcoming? I assume we all try to overcome.
Yeah. A lot of us seem to be a bit blasé about this. Yeah, we're biased, we think, but, you know, kids are kids or whatever. But some of us go, oh, my God, I'm biased. I could be wrong about everything. How can I deal with that? So some of us want to know, what can we do? How can we actually do better?
And are we wrong about a lot of things?
We're wrong about an awful lot of things. We're biased about who we want to hire. We're biased about who we like and think are better for jobs.
Now, the picture on top of your blog is Ulysses tied to the mast. Why?
Because it's so seductive. We think we're better than other people. We think we're prettier. We think we're moral. We think we're smarter. And Ulysses knew that he couldn't just count on himself not to listen to what they said and believe it. So he had to tie himself. He had to really constrain himself.
And so he ties himself to the mast, and he begs the other crew members,
please, please. But they had wax in their ears, so they couldn't hear. And that's the kind of thing we need to do if we're really going to overcome bias, because it's really hard.
For students, they evaluate teachers now in college. You found an interesting bias there.
It's well known that if the class is at a nice time, easy class, you give out more A's, you get better student evaluations. Now, universities could correct for that if they wanted, but they don't bother.
You think it's because the person is a better teacher?
It feels like that.
It feels like that to the rater. He's not just saying, oh, he gave me a good grade.
But just like the recruiter. That recruiter probably felt like this was really a better employee. It just happened to be a prettier employee, but that wasn't really part of the evaluation.
When a person says something, if they have high status, we are more likely to agree with them.
So you're at a party, and there's a physicist, prominent person, and he's pontificating about education. And on the other side of the room, there's a grade school teacher. Say they disagree about it. Now, who are you going to support? Well, the high status person, of course. You're going to listen to them, of course, because they're a big shot.
Sometimes you look for bias where you think you will find it, and you don't find this. You found this in the case of movie reviews.
Yeah, it turns out that a place like Fox owns a lot of different outlets, some of which review movies, and some of them are movies made by Fox. But it turns out they're not biased.
20th Century Fox makes movies like Avatar and iRobot, and also Dr. Dolittle too. Fox also owns the Wall Street Journal, New York Post. They have reviewers. And you're telling me they don't give better reviews to Fox movies?
Yeah, they don't. Why?
You'd think they'd worry about getting fired or getting demoted by their bosses.
Readers care about fair reviews, and there's a discipline, a market discipline, so that you need to supply the customers with what they want if you're going to succeed.
And I don't mean to single out Fox here. This applies to bunch of other companies
Absolutely.
that own movie studios. I could just use those films.
Right. So why aren't they biased, though, you could say? I mean, they work for Fox. They feel good about Fox. Why don't these biases work for them? Because they have an incentive.
To please the audience.
Incentives can overcome biases. Right.
Prediction markets help people do that.
Bet on it. So you've probably been in a conversation, an argument, where you get really pompous and you just make all these big claims, and then somebody says, okay, let's bet on it. And you'd feel it right then. You go, oh. Wait a minute. What exactly were we betting on? How are we going to word that exactly again? I didn't really mean that part. I was just saying something like this. And you back off and you clarify because you kind of know. Now you're on the hook. Incentives change your mind.
And prediction markets are groups of people doing that at locations like Predictit.com or Betfair, betting on future events, and they are more accurate than pundits.
Absolutely. So if you want to find out what the best estimate on a question is, and there's a betting market on it, just go look at the odds.
Thank you, Robert Hansen. To join this discussion, please follow me on Twitter at FBN Stossel. Use the hashtag Reason, or like my Facebook page so you can post on my wall. I want to know what you think. Coming up, most people believe a minimum wage helps the poor. Most people believe charity helps the poor more than investment. They're irrational. That's next.
Raise the wage!
Raise the wage! One of the simplest and fastest ways to start helping folks get ahead is by raising the minimum wage.
Raising the minimum sounds reasonable to most Americans. Recently, people in conservative states like Alaska, South Dakota, Nebraska voted to raise the minimum wage. Americans also support laws against price gouging and monopolies. But if you simply pay attention to free markets, you'd know that monopolies are not really a problem today, and that laws against price gouging deprive people of good things, of what they need after disasters, and that the minimum wage hurts poor people. Economist Garrett Jones says there are so many economic myths. So let's go over these three. Minimum wage first. Americans say help people.
Yeah, it seems obvious to a lot of people that giving low-income workers a raise is going to make them better off. And for the people who keep their jobs, that's definitely true. But if you just think about it, if even one person is losing their job, and more than one person is losing their job, if even one person's losing their job, that means less stuff is getting made. Our pie is getting smaller. So the minimum wage has to be making us poorer overall.
Price gouging laws. You ask anybody, should there be laws against price gouging? They say yes, gouging.
Especially after a natural disaster, people get really sympathetic to the claim that a few businesses are going to have the flashlights and the light bulbs and the batteries and the water. And so should they be allowed to charge more for what their scarce resources? But the problem is that after a crisis, that's just when you need more supply. That's when you need some guy with a pickup truck 100 miles away to throw a bunch of bottles of water in the back of his truck and drive into the disaster area. And price gouging laws keep that guy from doing that.
Far more people suffer.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that governments have to provide so much disaster relief is partly because they're not letting the invisible hand do its job.
Now, most schools say monopoly is a place where you have market failure. You know, if one company gets too big, they can raise their prices as much as they want and rip us off.
Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist, who taught us that when somebody sees a monopoly, other businesses want to come in and try to get that monopoly and steal it away from that one company. So every time there's one company with power, there are 5 or 10 or many more companies that are hot on the heels trying to put that company out of business with more competition.
And government called IBM a monopoly and Microsoft a monopoly.
And those companies have shrunk and they've lost market share. These companies that used to be at the center of our lives, companies like Microsoft, which people said, oh, they're going to run the internet. And I think the number of people who are using their browsers, relatively small now.
Natural resources are what make a country rich.
A lot of people take it for granted that natural resources make a country rich, but if you just look around at the world's richest economies and the world's economies that have started from poverty and boosted up into the middle and upper income brackets, places like Japan, a country with almost no natural resources, but our most important resource is the minds of our people.
And you have very poor countries with lots of natural resources like Nigeria.
And countries with a lot of natural resources often wind up in a world of civil war where people are fighting over that scarce form of wealth rather than building up the human mind that's the real source of wealth.
Finally, there's another thing everyone knows is true. What really helps people, poor people, is charity.
What helps people more, charity or capitalism?
Charity.
Oh my God. I'd say charity.
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 People just assume that.
But, you know, so if that were true, then, you know, people would not be getting richer in capitalist countries. It's the capitalist nations that are making people much more prosperous. And building up, sharing a bigger pie is a great thing to do, but first you have to have a big pie in the first place.
And as we approach Christmas, we think of Ebenezer Scrooge. You would argue he did more good for people, not when he bought them food to eat at dinner, but when he invested.
When he's saving money, he's keeping money in the bank. And that's money that gets lent out to investors, to people who want to build homes, to people who need to borrow money to make it past a rainy day. So
Disney was finding that sort of the imitation of him was Uncle Scrooge from the comics. They show him playing around in his pile of money, but that's not what entrepreneurs do with their money.
Whether they're putting it in a bank or whether they're investing it themselves, they're helping to grow the pie for somebody else. The best thing he can do is leave it to the invisible hand to allocate his wealth to whoever can do the most with it.
To millions of people. Thank you, Garrett Jones. Coming up, do you trust authority? What would you do if someone in authority told you, give a man with a heart condition horrible electric shocks?
He might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
"70 years ago, when most of the world learned about the Holocaust, people were shocked that so many German soldiers were willing to torture people. When Adolf Eichmann went on trial, he said, "I was just doing my job." One reporter at that trial called that the banality of evil. Neuroscientist David Eagleman studies this phenomenon. And David, you say that even reasonable people in a certain situation may become cruel.
This sort of thing happens all the time, where people will turn on their unarmed and defenseless neighbors and murder them. And so this led scholars to try to figure out, is there something wrong with millions of people's brains in terms of their disposition, or can situational forces lead people to do these things?
And what they concluded was that the power of the situation and other people was very powerful. One fun example of it is, well, you see this card here with this line on it? How long is the line? Which of these three, 1, 2, or 3, is it the same length as? Tell us what happened, David.
So this was an experiment by Solomon Asch that happened after the Holocaust. He wanted to figure out how people are influenced in their opinions by other people. The other people in the room with you were all shills, and they would all pick the wrong answer and say that some line that was obviously not equivalent was the right answer. Most people will change their answer just because of the social context.
Well, one of the professors who did that study, one of his students went on to become a psychologist and run the most famous demonstration of how good people do not always heed the reasonable part of their brain.
The teacher will read a list of word pairs to you like these. Blue girl, nice day, fat neck, and so forth. You are to try to remember each pair.
50 years ago, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted this nasty experiment.
Now, if you get it correct, fine. If you make an error, however, you'll be punished with an electric shock.
He called the people giving the shocks teachers.
Your teacher is about to begin the test. Try and remember the word pairs.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 75 volts.
Oh. The test subjects kept making mistakes.
150 volts.
Oh.
Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
Actually, the man did not have a heart condition and was not receiving the shocks. That was a recording.
Let me out.
Still, most teachers kept giving the shocks.
That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30.
Most also resisted.
I don't want to go any further with it.
But even though the experimenter had no real power over the teachers, he wasn't their boss or commanding officer, most still did what they were told.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
420 volts. 435 volts. 450 volts. He might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please continue.
I don't tend to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on them.
Finally, they told the test subjects the truth.
God bless you, boy. You have me shaking in here.
Nice to see you.
Same here.
I understand that a group of psychologists was asked to predict how many people would give the maximum voltage, and they thought less than 1%, but it turned out to be half the people.
About 65% of people went all the way up to the very top and gave the highest level of shock, even though they thought the person on the other side might be dead or unconscious. Both men and women, most of them went up to the very top.
Later, Stanley Milgram made a documentary about the experiments. The video we played was part of that. I like the way Milgram ended his documentary.
If in this study, an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
Yeah, I wonder too. Government gets to use force. This experimenter couldn't do that.
That's right. Milgram actually was Jewish, and after the Holocaust, he, like the rest of the world, was trying to figure out how these things happen, how you get lots of people to attack and kill their unarmed neighbors. And he found that if you put the subject closer by, then people are less likely to go to the top. If you put the experimenter, the guy in the white lab coat, farther away, then people are also less likely to go to the top.
And I even wonder if this experiment could be done today, because some of the experimenters say they were traumatized by giving the shocks and might not be allowed today.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not taught as much as it was when it first came out. And I think the most important thing is that every generation learns this and understands this, so that when they're in a situation with authority, they recognize the patterns in Milgram's experiments, like you set up simple rules, you give people titles like you're a teacher, or in other experiments you're a guard, things like that. There's some sort of goal happening. You make the exit costs high. There's a diffusion of responsibility where you tell the person, I'm responsible, not you. All of these things are the necessary ingredients for a population to have blind obedience.
Frightening. Thank you, David Eagleman. Coming up, this guy tries to reason with climate change protesters at a climate march. But the protesters weren't reasonable.
Excuse me. Hey, excuse me, this is private property. This is private property. This is mine.
What's reasonable to fear? Asking people in Times Square questions for this show. One question got the most yes answers. Here it is. Is global warming a big problem?
Yes, it is.
I think it's a huge issue and we're all killing ourselves.
It scares me. It should scare everybody. Look how bad the storms have gotten. Look how bad the fires get.
Look how bad the fires get. We're killing ourselves. Well, there have been some nasty storms lately. And this fall, a well-known environmental expert said this at the United Nations.
Accelerated climate change is here right now. Droughts are intensifying, our oceans are acidifying, with methane plumes rising up from the ocean floor. We are seeing extreme weather events and the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets melting at unprecedented rates, decades ahead of scientific projections. None of this is rhetoric, and none of it is hysteria. It is fact.
Fact. Extreme weather events, methane plumes rising up. We are told all scientists agree that we got to cut back on the use of fossil fuels. But then I see this book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. What? How can fossil fuels be moral? Alex Epstein wrote the book. What are you talking about? And you've got your I Love Fossil Fuel t-shirt on.
With everything in life, we need to look at the magnitude of both the risks and the benefits.
What's remarkable about your book, there's this dogma that the Earth is perfect without us and we don't mess it up. But in fact, as we've made the world warmer, assuming we have, climate deaths are down.
Yeah, the idea of perfect is exactly right. I've started calling it the perfect planet premise, which is that nature gave us a perfect planet and all we can do is mess it up. But if you went to someone 300 years ago and asked them, do you have a perfect climate compared to now, they were terrified of climate because climate doesn't give you the resources that you need. It doesn't give you water when you need it. It doesn't give you the temperature when you need it. We've really mastered climate. That's why so few people today die from climate, and DiCaprio should really learn this.
So deaths from climate are down?
Incredibly down. You know, last year you hear record, and we leave aside that most of that is bogus or out of context. Climate-related deaths were at a record low in supposedly the worst climate in history, under 30,000. Compare that to 1931, where you have 3.7 million, upwards of that. With a population less than 1/3 today. This is an incredible achievement of fossil fuels. And we have the luxury of being able to absorb a certain amount of climate-related damage so we can live in all of these cool places.
And in terms of deaths, also before the 70s, there may have been more deaths that we didn't know about.
Yeah, exactly. So now if we have a disaster, everyone knows about it. So it's just amazing how much we've mastered climate.
If people were in a drought in Bangladesh or there was a tornado, we didn't know.
Yeah, and think about today, even with all the aid, what is the incentive to over-report deaths? Because you get money for over-reporting deaths.
And the population is higher. So it should be much higher, but it's lower because of man.
And because environment is not something to submit to, it's something to master.
So the problem with the hype is that our lives are okay, but half the people on Earth don't have the fuel they need.
That means they have no machines to do work for them. That is a rough way to live.
And this is the only thing that's affordable. People think they could get it from wind power or solar power. Well, can't they?
There's not even one freestanding solar or wind plant in the entire world. Germany, the alleged model, gets 6% from solar and wind combined, and they can't rely on any of it. That's why they're relying on more coal and more wood.
This is just cruel to poor people. Alex likes to take his argument to college campuses and environmental groups. Here he is at the recent People's Climate March. At one point, some of the demonstrators got so angry at his I Love Fossil Fuels sign, they tried to rip it out of his hands.
Excuse me. Hey, excuse me, this is private property. This is private property. This is mine.
They're not so keen on private property.
I'm not sure she had heard those words strung together before.
America's Secretary of State seems convinced that climate change is a big problem. He says the science is absolutely certain.
The science of climate change is leaping out at us like a scene from a 3D movie. It's warning us, it's compelling us to act. When 97% of all scientists agree on anything, we need to listen.
What do you say to Secretary of State Kerry?
He's equating climate impact with climate catastrophe, and in that whole string in that speech that he gave to Indonesia, it's just, he starts from climate impact and then he says, oh yeah, and they all agree with my policies. So it ends with 97% agree with Kerry's political policies.
See, you're not a climate change skeptic, you're a climate catastrophe skeptic.
Yeah, skeptic is putting it nicely. I think I'm a climate catastrophe refuter at this point.
Thank you, Alex. Coming up, the thing that finally convinced me to become more reasonable. I have to admit, until 20 years ago, I wasn't so reasonable. I was a consumer reporter, and I fell for just about every hysteria that came up. Hey, scientists say chemicals at Love Canal are giving people cancer. Of course, government must regulate airline prices and get tough on illegal drugs. It was only after years of reporting that I realized, gee, the activists were wrong about Love Canal, and government regulation usually makes problems worse, and so does the drug war. I was confused. My liberal beliefs were being disproven by reality, so I stopped reading the liberal media so devoutly and turned to conservative publications. But when I read them, I thought, boy, they want to police my bedroom and police the whole world. That doesn't seem reasonable to me. Finally, I discovered this little magazine called Reason. It was skeptical of both left and right, and the more I read it, the more it made sense. These people really understand life much better than I do. Now, these people were not Matt Welch and Nick Gillespie, the current editors of Reason. You guys probably were barely out of diapers by then, if you are now.
But you go back in after a while.
How did you become reasonable so much more quickly than I did?
You know, for me, it was that my brother, who's older than me, went to college, found it in the college bookstore, and then started sending it home to me. And so
meaning this magazine.
The magazine in high school, and it, like you, it was. I was hearing a lot of stuff about how, oh, the right, you know, the right is always right, or the left is always right, and none of that spoke to me. And you know, Reason magazine, which talks about free minds and free markets. The founder hated hippies, and he hated cops who beat up hippies.
He hated hippies because he thought they were emotional and foolish.
Yeah, and destructive and hateful towards capitalism often.
And totalitarian in a way, in the way that they do things like try to censor free speech. It really took home for me after I came back to the United States after living in Central Europe for 8 years in the late 90s, when I came back looking for the same type of politics that you saw there, which is people hated communism, they loved capital markets and free markets, and they thought that there should be personal freedom to do what you wanted to do. And I came back and I looked for anyone who had that sense of beliefs, and it didn't really exist very much. I came across Reason, a magazine that was kind of about politics, but it also hated politics and tried to speak like humans speak. It was just immediately attracted to me in a way that all this kind of artificial faux media is not.
Yeah, and in a way, I think that was one of the things that always attracted me to it, is that, you know, we're a political magazine that hates politics because we think the most interesting things in life happen beyond that, and it happens in, you know, businesses like Uber or Airbnb, or on the internet, or in weird groups that people form together, whether they're religious communities or charities or things like that. There's so much more stuff that's interesting than what goes on in places like Washington, D.C.
But you got this arrogant title, Reason, implying everybody else isn't.
Well, the founder, Lanny Friedlander, he thought that we could dose the national debate with rationality. He said in his editor's note announcing the first issue, logic, not legends, coherence, not contradictions. He really believed, and this is a naive belief that we still share, that if you address this, even if you're some nobody coming out of left field, that ultimately you can change people's minds, including and especially people with whom you disagree about ideology and politics.
And, you know, speaking about the hysteria issues that you were talking about, you know, one of the first big articles that got a lot of national press from Reason was about Love Canal. And basically, we had a reporter go there, and what he showed was that the people...
Well, let's back up. Love Canal is this place in upstate New York.
Right, in Niagara Falls. It was a neighborhood that was ultimately built on a toxic chemical dump, and it became in the late 70s a kind of indicator of all that was wrong with corporate America. Corporate America was trying to make money by poisoning people by selling them property on, toxic dumps. And our reporter...
And this was giving people cancer, and this is why there was a cancer epidemic.
Yeah, exactly. Our reporter went up and he found out it was actually the school board of Niagara Falls that was the real bad actor here, because they had bought the property from the chemical company that said, hey, you know what, whatever you do, don't let anybody build on this. And then they sold it because they could make money on it. And then it also turned out that the science was bogus that was being used.
On two fronts, no one caught a cold from anything at Love Canal that's ever been proven, and there is no cancer epidemic in America, though people still think there is.
Let's at least get to the set of facts that we all can agree on, and then let's have the argument, rather than just arguing from emotional points of view or saying, facts don't matter. What really matters is my point of view.
And everyone's point of view was that airline prices were something that had to be controlled by government.
Not just airline prices, but even the food that they served on flights.
And the Civil Aeronautics Board controlled all that.
And if there was going to be a new route between New York and Houston, then the existing airlines that flew that route had to approve someone else flying that. And weirdly enough, they never really did.
And this was just accepted as the way things had to be.
This was until a cover story that we did, that the existing regulation of airlines did not make sense, and that if you deregulated them, prices would go down, competition would flourish, and they would become more safe. That was all seen as basically insane at the time, but that began a process which, lo and behold, only 5 years later, with the help of a lot of liberals like Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter and others, led to airline deregulation, which is one of the early and great examples of deregulation helping everybody. Upper class people were the only people who flew before deregulation. That changed after.
Thank you, Matt and Nick. Coming up, people believe in astrology, so I showed college students what I told them was their horoscope, but it was really this mass murderer's horoscope. I'll tell you what happened when we return. A Gallup poll says about 1/3 of Americans believe in astrology. In Times Square, it seemed like most did.
I love astrology. I'm a big believer, yeah.
Is it rational to believe in astrology?
Absolutely, absolutely. Everything happens from the stars.
Yeah, I'm deep into it.
Why? By what logic would the position of stars and the moon at the time of your birth govern your personality, let alone predict what will happen to you? It's not reasonable. I once paid a famous astrologer to do a chart on this man, Ed Kemper. She created a 25-page horoscope based on Kemper's birth date and time. Now, Kemper happens to be a serial killer who murdered 6 hitchhikers, his grandparents and his own mother. I then gave his horoscope to a class of college students. We'd gathered their birth dates before, and I told them, don't look at your neighbor's copy. This is personal. This is your 24-page horoscope. The students read the same 25 pages and then said things like, wow, I didn't believe in astrology before, but this is amazing. No one could have known all these things about me. I'm a believer. Why would they think Kemper's horoscope was theirs? Because astrologers and other fortune tellers, like psychics and palm readers, are good at telling people things that people think apply just to them. Maybe I can do it to you. After all, I can read your mind through the TV. I'll prove it to you. Think of the name of a country that starts with the letter D. Got one? Now take the second letter of that country and think of an animal that starts with that letter. Got it? I bet you're thinking of an elephant, right? I'm psychic. I know what you think. Or more reasonably, if you ask people to think of a country that begins with D, the country most of us think of is Denmark. Denmark's second letter is E. Most people think of an elephant rather than an eagle or electric eel. But maybe you thought I could read your mind. Likewise, astrologers tell people things that apply to most everyone. Oh, you have Jupiter in your 7th house, so people often collaborate with you to help you. Security is important to you. You have an above-average sense of humor. Well, most Americans think they have an above-average sense of humor. Also, when someone says lots of stuff like that, Kemper's horoscope was 24 pages, remember, they're bound to hit on some things that make you say, oh, yeah, that's really about me. I mean, listen to this one. She once did my horoscope. She cost a lot of money. And this year she said eclipses will have a dramatic effect on people with certain zodiac signs.
So here we have Taurus and Scorpio and Leo and Aquarius feeling that a bit more. If your sign wasn't mentioned, it doesn't mean you won't feel it because we have all the signs somewhere in our charts.
So you feel it if it's your sign and if it isn't your sign. Astrologers also flatter people. Oh, these 3 planets in Pisces make you very intuitive, and you have skills that haven't been tapped. They also give some specifics. Something may happen to your leg next month. You have a bunch of old magazines lying around the house. Much of that won't be true, but evolution's trained our brains to have something called confirmation bias. When there's lots of information, we focus on the things that are true. If you have old magazines around the house, you remember the hit. If you break your leg next month, you say, oh, the astrologer predicted that. But you forget the misses, the dozens of misses. Astrology's fun, but reason's better. I wish people applied reason to more parts of their lives and in the voting booth. That's our show. See you next week.